In less than 10 years, a single ministry controlled what more than 70 million people read, listened to, and watched. Every news piece, every movie, and every public voice came under a system designed to shape national perception without any possible opposition. Nazi propaganda functioned as a continuous machinery. It eliminated the independent press, reorganized art, controlled the radio, and turned cinema into a political instrument. During the war, it manipulated victories and defeats, created internal and external enemies, and maintained morale even when the country was on the verge of collapse. Nothing was beyond its reach. School, work, celebrations, and private life were absorbed by the official narrative. How could Goebbels establish such broad control over collective perception? Why was his system accepted for years without massive resistance? The emergence of the architect of control, the rise of Goebbels, and the construction of his propaganda apparatus. Joseph Goebbels did not come to power by chance or simply through loyalty to the Nazi Party. His rise was the result of a precise combination of communicative talent, excessive ambition, and an exceptional ability to understand the emotional voids of a fractured society. The Germany of the interwar period did not only need economic or military solutions, it needed a narrative that would restore its sense of identity. Goebbels understood this before many of his contemporaries and dedicated his life to becoming the architect of that narrative. His childhood took place in a Catholic, impoverished middle-class environment, marked by moral rigidity and frustrated aspirations of social ascension. An illness during childhood left him with a permanent disability in his leg, a condition that excluded him from physical activities and pushed him towards the world of books, ideas, and introspection. That physical limitation turned into an obsession to demonstrate intellectual superiority. From an early age, he developed a worldview where material restrictions could be overcome through willpower and the manipulation of perceptions. This idea would become, years later, the core of his propagandistic conception. During his university years, Goebbels studied literature, history, and philosophy. The German academic environment of the time was saturated with debates about national decline, cultural identity, and the moral collapse of the West. Those discussions fueled his need to find totalizing explanations for the German decline. The intellectuals he frequented interpreted the 1918 defeat not as a military failure, but as a spiritual wound. Goebbels absorbed that narrative and began to see it as an opportunity. If the war had been a defeat of the spirit, then the reconstruction had to be a feat of moral and emotional regeneration. He tried to make his way as a writer and playwright, but he failed. The cultural scene of Weimar, cosmopolitan and avant-garde, rejected the nationalist romanticism that he admired. This rejection did not sink him, it reoriented him. He understood that his narrative talent could find much more fertile ground in politics than in literature. There he could use his skills to build collective narratives, not individual works. Politics became his stage, and the masses his audience. The encounter with Adolf Hitler in the mid-20s was decisive. Goebbels did not see in him simply a charismatic leader, but the perfect protagonist for the narrative he wished to construct. Hitler embodied the figure of the common man elevated by the strength of his will, of the betrayed soldier who returns to redeem his people. Goebbels understood that his role was not to compete with Hitler, but to amplify him. He became the designer of the image, responsible for transforming Hitler not only into an influential politician, but into a figure inseparable from German destiny. When he was appointed propaganda chief of the Nazi Party in Berlin in 1926, he faced the most difficult challenge of his career. The German capital was dominated by liberal press, organized labor movements, and intellectual circles that rejected nationalism. Goebbels quickly understood that it was not enough to spread messages. The emotional climate of the city had to be altered. His strategy consisted of generating continuous presence, rallies, pamphlets, party newspapers, provocative posters, rhetorical confrontations. The key was to transform the Nazi Party into an unavoidable actor, even for its detractors. To achieve this, he worked with a theatrical sense of politics. Each public act had to be designed as a spectacle with a dramatic structure. He also understood that it was necessary to create clear antagonists. In Nazi rhetoric, the enemies were not political rivals, but existential threats. This simplification allowed emotion to prevail over data. In Berlin, he perfected the art of turning each conflict into a test of the party's resilience and each criticism into a confirmation of its importance. Hostility was transformed into free publicity. This stage was decisive because it forced him to develop direct methods of mass manipulation, control of the emotional rhythm of rallies, selective use of rumors to generate tension, exploitation of fear in working-class neighborhoods, use of political violence as a narrative tool. Although the Nazis did not dominate the city, Goebbels ensured that their presence was constant and loud, forcing the rival press to react to them, and therefore to amplify them. When Hitler was appointed Chancellor in January of 1933, Goebbels was already prepared to transform propaganda into a state instrument. The first thing he did upon assuming the role of Minister of Propaganda was to reorganize the German media system to eliminate the areas of autonomy that still existed. He understood that information had to flow vertically from the ministry to all cultural levels. Therefore, he did not limit himself to controlling newspapers. He delved into areas that seemed independent of politics: theatre, music, visual arts, sports, aesthetic education. For him, every cultural expression had a political function, even if its producers did not know it. The ministry operated as a centralized body composed of specialized departments. Each had teams dedicated to supervising content, defining narrative lines, and coordinating public responses. Unlike other authoritarian states of the period, the Nazi regime gave propaganda a leading, not secondary, role. Goebbels insisted that propaganda should anticipate events, not merely comment on them. Its objective was to create a prior interpretative framework, a way of viewing the world that made each event fit into a narrative of national destiny. One of the first steps was to subject the press to a coordination process. The newspapers were not abolished, but transformed into instruments of a single discourse. To achieve this, morning meetings were organized where the day's topics, mandatory interpretations, and allowed approaches were communicated. Although there were multiple mastheads, they all reflected the same government vision. The apparent diversity served to reinforce the illusion of normality. Different voices repeated the same message, which increased its credibility. At the same time, Goebbels understood that propaganda had to be inseparable from everyday experience. The radio, in particular, became the ideal medium for this purpose. The regime promoted the production of inexpensive devices, accessible to millions of households. This act, presented as a technological advancement, was in reality a strategy for social penetration. Once inside the home, the voice of the state acquired an intimate tone, almost familiar. Goebbels sought precisely that, to install the official narrative in the private space, where the receiver would be more relaxed and therefore more permeable. Cinema was another essential pillar in his project. Although not all films produced were overtly political, many subtly reinforced values akin to the regime: sacrifice, discipline, unity, obedience, identification with the leader. The aim was for the propaganda not to be perceived as such. Goebbels firmly believed that the most effective message is the one not recognized as a message. The viewer should feel that the emotions aroused were their own, not induced. Behind this media framework was hidden a specific conception of the human being. For Goebbels, the individual was not a fully rational subject, but an emotional, influenceable entity seeking order and belonging. His job was to systematically offer those elements. Through repetition, ritual exaltation, and the creation of symbols, he constructed a universe in which Nazi ideology was presented as a natural fact. The propaganda not only informed, it reconfigured reality. The construction of the Hitler cult was perhaps his most elaborate work. It did not describe him solely as a political leader, but as an embodiment of the nation itself. In speeches, films, and public events, the Führer was presented as a compendium of German virtues: willpower, discipline, clairvoyance. The propaganda did not limit itself to spreading his image, but to creating an emotional bond between the people and their leader. In this sense, Hitler was not a man, he was a narrative function. Goebbels ensured that every military success, every economic announcement, every public celebration reinforced the perception that Hitler was indispensable to the destiny of the country. The process culminated in the development of a direct, simple, and forceful communication style. Goebbels understood that complex messages dissolve in the masses. He preferred clear ideas, moral dichotomies, linear narratives. The style was not the result of ignorance, but of calculation. He wanted the propaganda to be accessible to everyone, from industrial workers to farmers and housewives. His vision was that no citizen should be left out of the national narrative. The construction of this propaganda apparatus was not a simple administrative operation, but a project of collective transformation. Every medium, every public act, every image, and every rumor were part of an ecosystem designed to synchronize the perception of millions of people. Goebbels believed in propaganda not as an auxiliary tool of power, but as its foundation. For him, controlling the interpretation of reality was more important than controlling reality itself. Therefore, from the ministry, he shaped public consciousness with the precision of a craftsman and the ambition of a social engineer. The case of Goebbels raises a central question: how a political system can transform communication into a tool capable of defining not only public opinion, but the limits of what is imaginable within a society. His method was not based solely on controlling content, but on regulating the emotional context in which it was received. This point is essential to understanding why his influence exceeded the traditional reach of propaganda. It was not about convincing, but about establishing a prior mental framework in which any message, even contradictory, could be integrated without fracturing internal cohesion. Another relevant dimension is the relationship between the propagandist leader and the state structure. Goebbels did not operate in a vacuum. His effectiveness depended on an environment that voluntarily gave up plurality in exchange for order and belonging. This phenomenon reveals that the most effective propaganda arises when society is already willing, for its own reasons, to reorganize its worldview. Manipulation becomes viable when the population seeks simple answers to complex problems. It is also significant how propaganda functioned as a social technology. It operated not only through messages, but through the creation of rituals, routines, and habits. The repetition of these practices transformed ideology into custom, and custom into norm. This process explains why the propaganda apparatus could maintain collective expectations even when reality was already impossible to hide. Finally, the figure of Goebbels demonstrates to what extent the interpretation of events can surpass the events themselves in their ability to influence human behavior. His legacy does not lie in the lies he spread, but in having shown that a narrative, sustained with enough coherence and persistence, can become a form of authority equivalent to physical force. The engineering of perception, how propaganda shaped everyday German life. Once the regime was consolidated, propaganda ceased to function as a tool of political persuasion to become the invisible architecture of everyday life. The average German citizen no longer faced propagandistic messages as something external. They experienced them as a natural part of their environment. Goebbels had achieved something extraordinary, transforming propaganda into atmosphere. Every public gesture, every collective celebration, every cultural object acquired a political meaning without the majority perceiving it as imposition. Daily life became indistinguishable from the official message. The first front of this engineering was education. Although the school programs did not change radically from one day to the next, the way in which the contents were interpreted did transform. History was reorganized as a heroic narrative where the German people appeared as victims of internal betrayals and external aggressions, destined to recover their greatness. Biology adopted a pseudoscientific language aimed at justifying racial hierarchies and the need to protect German purity. Physical education was reinforced as a discipline to build strong, healthy, and obedient bodies. It was not just about teaching content, but about generating a way of feeling national belonging. From a young age, children learned to interpret society through a carefully designed emotional filter. Outside of school, youth organizations became another fundamental pillar. The Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls for Girls created a community that mixed sports, discipline, ritual, and camaraderie. These organizations functioned as emotional training spaces where young people learned to trust more in their collective leaders than in family structures. Propaganda was not transmitted through explicit lessons, but through the experience itself: marches, camps, anthems, badges, night ceremonies. Youth unity was not sustained by political content, but by the sense of belonging it generated. Goebbels understood that each emotion provoked there would eventually transform into ideological adherence without the need for reasoning. In the adult world, propaganda operated in a more subtle yet equally constant manner. The radio played a decisive role. With the mass production of the Volksempfänger, an inexpensive and simply designed receiver, state propaganda entered millions of homes. The device was not just a dissemination tool, but a symbol of modernity accessible to the population. By listening to the broadcasts, the German family felt part of a unified national community. The broadcasts were not saturated with political speeches. On the contrary, they were combined with musical programs, dramatizations, and sports broadcasts. This mixture made the ideological message filter in a natural way. When the announcer introduced news about government decisions or military victories, it was done in the same tone as presenting a concert or a cultural recommendation. This process reduced the distance between propaganda and entertainment, merging both into a single emotional flow. The print media reinforced this climate. Although there were multiple newspapers, all received the same daily directives from the Ministry of Propaganda. Citizens might have had the impression that they were choosing between different options, but in reality, all the front pages, headlines, and analyses followed the same narrative line. The uniformity sought not only to inform, but to generate a sense of stability. When all the media agreed on the interpretation of events, it created the illusion that this interpretation was the only possible one. Any dissent was automatically expelled from the public space. Urban aesthetics also transformed into a propaganda tool. Squares, streets, and public buildings began to fill with flags, banners, symbols, and slogans. Images of the leader occupied a prominent place. Portraits, busts, and posters reinforced his constant presence. At mass events, like May 1st or the regime's anniversaries, the city became a monumental stage. These scenographies not only communicated power, they generated a feeling of belonging. Citizens not only saw the ideology, they inhabited it. Goebbels knew that the most effective propaganda was that which was experienced with the body, not just with the mind. Public festivities played a central role in this collective experience. The regime reorganized the annual calendar to include events that reinforced the narrative of German rebirth. Party Day in Nuremberg, Hitler's birthday, tributes to the fallen of the movement, harvest celebrations. These ceremonies were not simple political acts. They were designed as rituals. Night parades with torches, carefully synchronized speeches, choirs, choreography, and displays of military strength produced an aesthetic that mixed solemnity, emotion, and unity. Goebbels understood that the annual repetition of these rituals created emotional memory. Every citizen knew what to feel and when to feel it, and that predictability generated a sense of stability in a world in transformation. Cinema reinforced this emotional environment. The films did not need to be explicitly political to function as propaganda. Many were comedies, romantic dramas, or historical adventures that reinforced values associated with the regime: obedience, sacrifice, discipline, moral purity, service to the community. The figure of the cinematic hero was not necessarily a soldier or a Nazi militant, but embodied qualities that the regime wanted to promote. Films with military or historical themes were used to create symbolic parallels between contemporary Germany and a heroic past. Cinema allowed the viewer to experience intense emotions in a controlled way. Each tear, applause, or sigh reinforced the state narrative about German identity. Propaganda also penetrated daily life through seemingly innocent cultural products. Popular songs incorporated military melodies. Entertainment magazines included reports on the social achievements of the regime. Children's games reproduced symbols and hierarchies of the Nazi world. Even domestic architecture was influenced by aesthetic ideals promoted by the ministry. Sober forms, local materials, styles inspired by the German rural tradition. These initiatives sought to create a visual environment coherent with the state narrative, harmony, order, and connection to the land. In the workplace, the German Labour Front replaced the unions and reorganized professional life under a paternalistic discourse. Through programs like Strength Through Joy, vacations, recreational activities, and subsidized trips were offered. These benefits not only promoted productivity, but reinforced the idea that the state took care of its citizens. What, in other circumstances, would have been a social policy was presented as an expression of the Nazi community spirit. The propaganda did not seek to glamorize work, but to turn it into an act of national service. Within the home, propaganda adopted even more subtle tones. Women's magazines promoted a model of motherhood linked to racial duty. Recipes emphasized self-sufficiency in times of scarcity. And children's publications showcased stories where the regime's values were conveyed in a friendly manner. Domesticity was transformed into an ideological space. Every decision, from decoration to children's education, could be interpreted as a contribution to the national project. Propaganda did not need to impose, it modeled silently. The emotional control of the German people also depended on the construction of the enemy. The regime needed to create figures that represented everything the new Germany rejected: degeneration, chaos, betrayal, external threat. Propaganda assigned these functions to different groups at various stages of the regime. In the early years, emphasis was placed on the supposed moral corruption of the Weimar Republic and foreign manipulation. Later, the enemies were embodied in specific figures: political adversaries, critics of the regime, populations considered undesirable, and foreign powers. Each image of the enemy sought to channel collective frustrations and fears, creating the illusion that the regime provided protection and order. This mosaic of strategies generated a uniform emotional reality. The citizens experienced their lives through a filter that diluted complexity. The propaganda did not seek to convince through arguments, but to shape the emotional climate of the country. By offering stability, belonging, identity, and explanation, it became a constant reference for interpreting reality. Over time, the propaganda achieved something even deeper. It instilled the idea that individual life should be put in the service of a larger project. By turning the private sphere into an extension of the official discourse, the regime managed to get millions of people to internalize its narrative as a natural part of their existence. It was not necessary to repeat slogans to be part of the system. It was enough to live within it. This process turned propaganda into a fundamental component of the social structure of the Third Reich. It not only shaped opinions, but habits, emotions, and expectations. Through symbols, rituals, art, and entertainment, Goebbels transformed everyday life into a stage where every gesture, every celebration, and every silence reinforced loyalty to the regime. What began as a political strategy ended up becoming a way of life. The analysis of the impact of propaganda on everyday German life shows that the true power of the regime did not lie in its messages, but in its ability to occupy spaces that, in other societies, remain outside the political realm. The progressive occupation of the school, home, work, leisure, and community rituals reveals a fundamental mechanism: normalization. When a system manages to make its values part of the daily rhythm, it no longer needs explicit persuasion. The population does not repeat slogans because they believe them, but because the social structure incorporates them as part of the usual. Another relevant aspect is the way propaganda eliminated the distance between the individual and the state. In most political systems, private life acts as a barrier against the intrusion of power. Under the apparatus designed by Goebbels, that barrier disappeared. The citizen lost their own symbolic space. Propaganda was integrated into simple tasks, from listening to the radio to cooking, educating children, or participating in local celebrations, to the point of making it almost impossible to distinguish where personal routine ended and where state logic began. This loss of boundaries is a clear indicator of the depth with which a regime can shape identities without the need to resort to direct violence. Finally, everyday experience under Nazi propaganda highlights that the most effective manipulation does not always seek to transform deep convictions, but to guide practical behaviors. Accepting a directive, attending a mandatory event, following a school ritual, or avoiding a critical comment does not necessarily imply ideological adherence, but it does produce an adaptation that, repeated in millions of individuals, supports the functioning of the system. In that sense, the chapter reveals that daily life was not simply a stage for propaganda. It was the ground where the regime consolidated its real control. The mechanism of the total state, media, censorship, and the perfection of the national illusion. The Ministry of Propaganda functioned as the operating brain of the Third Reich. It was not just another department within the state bureaucracy, but the backbone that guaranteed the ideological cohesion of the entire system. Goebbels had built a complex machinery, divided into specialized departments, that controlled every area of public expression: press, radio, cinema, theater, music, visual arts, literature, foreign propaganda, public opinion, and the organization of mass events. Each area operated with technical teams, editors, and supervisors who worked under precise protocols. The goal was not simply to transmit correct messages, but to generate a constant emotional climate that eliminated any possibility of an alternative vision. The written press represented one of the most visible pillars of control. The German newspapers retained their traditional names and many of their editorial structures, but lost all real independence. Each morning, the editors received detailed instructions on the topics of the day, the authorized approach, and the interpretive limits. These guidelines covered headlines, photographs, language, and the length of the articles. Even local newspapers had to synchronize with the national narrative. This apparent diversity fulfilled an essential psychological function, creating the illusion of normality in a society where opposing viewpoints no longer existed. The reader could choose between several newspapers, but they all said exactly the same thing. The radio operated under an even more centralized logic. Goebbels understood from the beginning its unique potential. It could penetrate simultaneously into millions of homes without competition or interruptions. The synchronization of stations allowed the same message to reach all of Germany at the same time, with the same emotional tone. In critical moments, the broadcast dictated not only information, but also the emotion with which it should be received. Hitler's speeches were carefully edited before being broadcast, transforming into collective rituals where millions of Germans experienced the same exhilaration simultaneously. The radio did not inform, it orchestrated moods. Cinema developed as the most sophisticated tool of the apparatus. Its control required continuous surveillance over scripts, casting, filming, editing, distribution, and exhibition. Goebbels did not seek to flood the theaters with explicit propaganda, but to design a cinematic environment where even seemingly neutral films indirectly reinforced the values of the regime. Historical dramas, light comedies, and rural romances were authorized only if they adhered to specific ideological parameters. The portrayal of a disciplined, harmonious, and obedient people was repeated in multiple formats. The spectator, surrounded by this coherent atmosphere, ended up accepting as natural what was a deliberate construction. The performing arts were also subjected to exhaustive supervision. Theatres had to request authorization for each repertoire. Experimental, cosmopolitan, or considered degenerate works were eliminated. Rural, historical, and mythological themes received systematic promotion because they reinforced the image of a homogeneous and rooted people. Music, from symphonic concerts to popular repertoires, was integrated into the ideological project. Composers linked to the regime received state support. Those considered inappropriate faced marginalization or direct prohibition. State orchestras conveyed an aesthetic that emphasized solemnity, purity, and national grandeur. Beyond content production, the Nazi regime perfected mechanisms of preventive censorship. The ministry did not limit itself to banning the undesirable. It controlled every phase of the creative process. Before a book reached printing, it went through filters that assessed its ideological tone, emotional impact, and potential influence on the public. Publishers knew the parameters necessary to avoid problems, which generated widespread self-censorship. Many writers did not need to receive explicit bans. The pressure of the environment was enough to guide their creativity towards acceptable themes. This mechanism produced a cultural ecosystem where conformity operated as an invisible norm. The scientific field also did not escape propagandistic control. Universities, laboratories, and academic societies had to align research and publications with state objectives. Some disciplines, such as theoretical physics or engineering, maintained relative margins of autonomy. Others, such as anthropology, social medicine, and history, were completely absorbed by racial and political ideology. Propaganda transformed science into academic validation of the regime's policies, eliminating possibilities for intellectual debate. School texts and technical manuals reflected this convergence between knowledge and official message. Goebbels also designed a system for immediate response to crises or rumors. If an economic tension erupted, a military setback, or any situation threatened emotional stability, the ministry reacted in a coordinated manner. Official statements, interpretative articles, speeches by local leaders, special radio programs, and public events ensured that the population received a single explanation. The informational void represented a danger because it generated doubts. Propaganda could only sustain the illusion of unity if it also controlled uncertainty. In moments where reality threatened to overwhelm the official narrative, the ministry intensified the production of messages until the emotional tension was resolved. The visual control complemented this propagandistic architecture. The regime's aesthetics, based on linearity, monumentality, and harmony, extended from government buildings to street posters. The official photography depicted Hitler, the party leaders, and the German people in carefully crafted poses. Gazes toward the horizon, firm gestures, orderly crowds. Each image conveyed strength, direction, and discipline. Independent photojournalism almost completely disappeared. The population only saw idealized versions of society, where poverty, disorder, and dissent had no place. Architecture became the physical expression of totalitarian power. Government buildings, squares, and avenues sought to impress, communicate permanence and grandeur. Monumental structures fulfilled a specific propagandistic purpose, to generate a feeling of smallness in the individual and reinforce the perception that the regime was unbreakable. Goebbels understood that propaganda had to materialize in the space inhabited by people. Monumentality was not just aesthetic, it was psychological. The coordination between propaganda and surveillance completed the system. Although the Ministry of Propaganda was not a police body, it worked closely with the Gestapo, the Ministry of the Interior, and regional party leaders. If an artist, writer, or journalist challenged the established boundaries, the punishment came from both the cultural apparatus and police mechanisms. This interconnection generated a climate where any deviation could have severe consequences. Without the need to impose direct terror in every case, the propaganda made the population internalize obedience as natural behavior. This framework not only shaped perceptions, but also created a coherent emotional experience. Citizens lived within a closed symbolic universe. Contradictions could be perceived, but not openly expressed. External information was filtered and reinterpreted according to official parameters. The state managed not only what people saw and heard, but how they should feel about it. This emotional management maintained an artificially but profoundly effective national cohesion. Throughout the 1930s, propaganda achieved its main objective: to erase the distinction between truth and official narrative. For very many Germans, the state's version of events was not just an interpretation, but reality itself. The national illusion worked because it was experienced daily, in every space and gesture. Propaganda did not ask for faith, it built habit. Gradually, the population stopped distinguishing between information, spectacle, and obedience. Everything was part of the same emotional system. The entry into the war made this mechanism even more essential. Propaganda not only had to mobilize, but also psychologically support a nation subjected to extreme tensions. Thanks to the previously constructed apparatus, the state maintained internal cohesion for years, even in moments of defeat. This achievement was not due solely to fear, but to the methodical work of Goebbels, a population accustomed to seeing reality through an ideological filter accepted the most extreme official reinterpretations without resistance. The machinery of the Ministry of Propaganda was not a simple accompaniment to Nazi power. It was its mental structure. Without it, the regime could not have generated the illusion of unanimity, nor sustained the war, nor prolonged collective obedience. It was the mechanism that allowed millions of people to live under a fabricated vision and believe in it as if it were a natural fact. Goebbels had built more than a communication apparatus. He had created an alternative reality that worked as long as no one had access to another version of the facts. The study of the Nazi media apparatus exposed in this chapter shows that censorship did not operate solely as a prohibition of information, but as a complete reorganization of the communicative ecosystem. The most significant aspect was not what ceased to be published, but the creation of an environment in which only one interpretation of the world was possible. This approach reveals that the most effective propagandistic power is not based on silencing voices, but on preventing the existence of a point of comparison. Where there is no contrast, there is no doubt, and where there is no doubt, the dominant narrative automatically becomes perceived truth. Another key element is the way the regime integrated technique and emotionality into a single mechanism. Nazi propaganda did not use radio, cinema, or the press as mere channels, but as coordinated tools that worked simultaneously on different layers of the human experience. The result was a system where the citizen received coherent, repeated, and reinforced messages from multiple directions, which reduced the possibility of individual questioning. Emotional uniformity, more than ideological uniformity, was the real goal of the apparatus. This chapter also allows reflection on the role of self-censorship as a direct product of total control. The absence of visible alternatives led many creators, journalists, and academics to spontaneously adjust their output, even before receiving formal guidelines. This dynamic reveals that the most effective censorship is not that which is imposed from above, but that which the system itself induces within each social actor. Once self-censorship becomes part of everyday behavior, the regime no longer needs to oversee every gesture. Control is internalized. Taken together, this reflection shows that the true achievement of the Nazi media apparatus was not the propaganda itself, but the creation of an environment where the official narrative became the only possible way to interpret reality. Propaganda as a weapon, the manipulation of war, the enemy, and the national destiny. The German territorial expansion marked the beginning of a new phase in Goebbels' propaganda strategy. It was no longer enough to maintain internal stability. It was necessary to build an epic narrative that legitimized each military movement and presented the war not as a strategic decision, but as an inevitable historical mandate. Propaganda transformed into a weapon of combat, It did not fire projectiles, but it shaped perceptions, justified aggressions, and maintained national morale in moments where reality challenged the myth of German power. From the first expansionist moves, especially the annexation of Austria and the occupation of the Sudetenland, the propaganda presented these events as natural restorations of the European order. The narrative insisted that Germany was not conquering, but recovering territories whose inhabitants longed to reunite with the Reich. The images disseminated showed smiling crowds, waving flags, and choreographed celebrations. The propaganda concealed real tensions, internal oppositions, and military strategies. For the German population, each territorial advance was not a war maneuver, but the confirmation of national destiny. The construction of the enemy played a crucial role in this phase. Goebbels needed to explain why Germany had to confront multiple nations without appearing as the aggressor. To achieve this, he enhanced the figure of the external enemy as a threatening force. Poland was presented as a hostile state that attacked German minorities. France and Great Britain appeared as hypocritical powers that hindered the German resurgence. Soviet communism and the supposed international conspiracy were described as existential dangers. The narrative was not based on verifiable facts, but on an emotional climate of defensive urgency. Germany, with all its military strength, portrayed itself as a victim of an unjust encirclement. The outbreak of the Second World War allowed the Ministry of Propaganda to fully deploy its machinery. Each victory, no matter how small, was amplified through radio broadcasts, newsreels, and synchronized headlines. The images of soldiers advancing, tanks moving, and planes soaring through the sky built a sense of inevitable technical superiority. The newsreels, carefully edited, removed scenes of chaos, improvisation, or fatigue. The army was portrayed as a perfect, coordinated, and practically invincible force. As the conflict intensified, Goebbels began to use an essential resource: the manipulation of emotional rhythm. The initial military campaigns, especially in Poland, Norway, Belgium, and France, were presented as examples of unmatched surgical precision. The message insisted that each operation had unfolded exactly as planned, and that victory was the result of the strategic genius of the German leadership. This narrative reinforced internal confidence and made it difficult for the population to perceive the true human cost of the conflict. The invasion of the Soviet Union opened a new propaganda chapter. The East was portrayed as a wild, chaotic, backward, and ideologically contaminated territory. The propaganda maintained that the war against the Soviet Union was not only a geopolitical conflict, but a battle for the survival of Europe. This strategy had a dual purpose: to justify the extreme brutality of the campaign and to emotionally prepare the population for a war of attrition that would not be easily resolved. In the newsreels, the Eastern Front was represented as a stage where the German soldier waged an almost mythological fight against countless forces. The scale was deliberately exaggerated to give meaning to the sacrifice. The internal enemy became an indispensable element of the war narrative. Propaganda linked the external threat with figures considered undesirable within German territory. This mental operation allowed the regime to justify extreme repressive measures by presenting them as an essential part of the war effort. Surveillance, denunciation among neighbors, and institutional purges were integrated into a discourse that demanded absolute unity. The enemy, more than a military entity, became a psychological presence. It could be anywhere and had to be eradicated. In parallel, the ministry deployed a visual strategy aimed at reinforcing the heroism of the German soldier. The official photographs showed disciplined troops, impeccable uniforms, and determined faces. The figure of the combatant became a symbol of national devotion. Goebbels sought to make the soldier not only a military agent, but also a moral ideal. This representation allowed the harshness of the front, hunger, cold, and exhaustion to be concealed. As the situation in the East worsened drastically, the image of the heroic soldier sacrificing himself for a future that seemed increasingly abstract was maintained. With the increase in casualties and the growing difficulty in emotionally sustaining the war, Goebbels intensified the use of visual and emotional contrasts. Newsreels showed European cities destroyed by Allied bombings, highlighting the supposed indiscriminate attack against civilians. The intention was clear: to reinforce the idea that Germany was fighting against a ruthless enemy. This strategy aimed to turn defeat into outrage and outrage into resistance. The propaganda not only had to hide bad news, it needed to transform the experience of suffering into fuel for loyalty. One of the most decisive moments in this strategy occurred with the defeat at Stalingrad. The magnitude of the disaster was impossible to hide, and Goebbels had to choose between lying and losing credibility or accepting the defeat and reinterpreting it. He opted for the latter. The newsreels and newspapers presented the fall of Stalingrad as a heroic sacrifice. The soldiers who died or were captured were transformed into martyrs of the fight against Bolshevism. The speech insisted that only a truly great people were capable of facing such a harsh test. That rhetorical operation allowed the defeat not to erode internal support, but to harden it. The collective suffering was reinterpreted as an act of redemption. As the war progressed to a defensive phase, propaganda adapted again. The campaigns of 1943 and 1944 concentrated their efforts on maintaining civilian morale in the face of massive bombings. Images of destroyed cities were used carefully. They did not seek to generate despair, but to convey resilience. Goebbels instructed his teams to show civilians clearing debris, workers repairing infrastructure, and groups of women organizing collective kitchens. The narrative insisted that Germany had become a fortress whose inhabitants not only fought with weapons, but with their spirit. The manipulation of emotional timing also played an essential role. Speeches, radio programs, and articles were organized to alternate tension and relief. After negative news, encouraging messages about supposed technological advances, new weapons, or strategic alliances were added. Even when this information was exaggerated or directly false, it served its purpose, preventing psychological collapse. In the last few months of the war, propaganda entered a phase that combined desperation and fanaticism. Goebbels promoted the idea of total war, a slogan that demanded the German people sacrifice everything for the survival of the state. The propaganda of this stage appealed less to historical greatness and more to the urgent need to resist until the end. Radio broadcasts called for turning every street and building into a line of defense. The narrative insisted that surrender was equivalent to the destruction of Germany, and that the only dignified option was to fight to the limit. Even when defeat was imminent, the propaganda maintained the illusion that a possible turn existed. Rumors of new miracle weapons, fractures within the Allies, and non-existent secret negotiations were spread. The purpose was not to deceive effectively, but to avoid total emotional collapse. Goebbels believed that, as long as the population maintained some form of hope, the regime could continue functioning. This strategy prolonged German resistance beyond what many military conditions would have allowed. In retrospect, Nazi propaganda during the war not only explained the violence, but it made it emotionally acceptable. It transformed aggressions into defenses, defeats into sacrifices, and atrocities into acts of national survival. The war became a distorting mirror that reflected not reality, but the official narrative. Millions of Germans experienced the conflict as an inevitable destiny, not as a political decision. And that perception was one of the darkest triumphs of the Ministry of Propaganda. The machinery created by Goebbels managed to sustain the illusion, even as the world crumbled around the regime. Society in mirrors, reactions, silent resistances, and the human experience under propaganda domination. Nazi propaganda did not act on a homogeneous society or on a completely receptive audience. Although it managed to shape perceptions and establish a dominant emotional framework, the human experience under the propaganda apparatus was diverse, complex, and in many cases contradictory. Germans did not experience propaganda uniformly. They interpreted it, adapted it, resisted it, or accepted it according to their personal circumstances, their fears, their environment, and their position within the social structure. The regime, aware of these differences, designed its machinery of persuasion not only to convince, but to silently absorb as many divergent attitudes as possible. In the first years, the widespread enthusiasm for economic stability and the decrease in unemployment facilitated the propaganda penetration. The industrial working class, especially in urban areas, initially reacted with caution, but social programs and the sense of order helped to soften resistance. In many cases, propaganda acted as an emotional language that reduced internal tensions. For families who had experienced the instability of Weimar, the constant presence of the regime on radios, newspapers, and public celebrations generated a sense of continuity. Although not everyone identified with the ideological discourse, they did benefit from the atmosphere of apparent security. Among housewives, the propagandistic experience acquired a particular nuance. Messages addressed to women emphasized the importance of home, motherhood, and family unity within the national project. Women's magazines, radio programs, and public posters presented these roles as pillars of the German future. This message generated internal tensions. Some women accepted it as part of an order that gave them recognition. Others experienced it as a restriction disguised as an ideal. Domestic life became a space where propaganda subtly penetrated, from children's education to recommended recipes during the years of rationing. Not all of these messages were believed, but they infiltrated daily habits. Resistance in this area was silent and consisted of reinterpreting or relativizing official demands without expressing it openly. Among the young people, the propaganda machinery reached one of its deepest levels of emotional influence. The youth organizations offered identity, camaraderie, belonging, and a clear structure of symbolic rewards. For many adolescents living in tense or unstable homes, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls were not just political organizations, but social spaces where they could experience success, recognition, and a sense of purpose. However, this adherence was not absolute. Some young people imitated the required enthusiasm without truly experiencing it. Others developed attitudes of superficial obedience that faded in adult life. In industrial and rural workers, propaganda worked through a mixture of paternalism and psychological pressure. The German Labour Front promoted the idea of a labour community united by higher goals, concealing the real inequalities. Through recreational programs and social benefits, propaganda transformed work into an act of national loyalty. However, behind the scenes, many workers maintained private criticisms. They knew that propaganda amplified achievements and silenced problems. Resistance manifested in discreet comments, jokes about local leaders, or apathy towards the regime's rituals. These gestures did not threaten the system, but they revealed that adherence to propaganda was not always sincere. The urban middle classes, more exposed to external information and more aware of the mechanisms of propaganda, experienced a more ambivalent relationship with the regime. Many benefited from the economic stability, but they did not ignore the artificial nature of the official narratives. The uniform press and repetitive radio broadcasts generated, in some sectors, a feeling of saturation. However, this perception rarely turned into open opposition. Propaganda had managed to link any criticism of the regime with treason. Self-censorship became an everyday practice, fueled by social pressure and the possibility of sanctions. The religious groups experienced a complex situation. Although the regime sought to co-opt the churches and absorb them into a state model, many believers clearly distinguished between religious rituals and political rituals. The propaganda tried to reinterpret certain Christian values as justifications for national sacrifice, but not always successfully. In some communities, the regime's discourse clashed with deeply rooted traditions. In these cases, resistance was manifested through veiled sermons, discreet meetings, or simple silences loaded with meaning. While these expressions did not challenge the Nazi structure, They showed that the propaganda found limits in spaces where the collective identity had roots prior to the regime. The hardest spectrum of resistance, even without being expressed publicly, came from individuals who perceived early on the destructive nature of the system. Doctors, teachers, scientists, and bureaucrats who had access to broader information understood that the official narrative concealed unsettling realities. But even among them, opposition remained quiet. The regime had managed to link, through propaganda and surveillance, dissent with personal risk. The psychological pressure was so intense that many preferred to adapt outwardly while reserving their critical thinking for private spaces. In the persecuted minorities, the propaganda experience was radically different. Propaganda not only made them invisible, but also turned them into demonized elements. For the Jewish population, for example, propaganda was not just background noise, it was a constant threat. Anti-Semitic posters, degrading caricatures, and incendiary articles created an atmosphere of hostility that affected all aspects of daily life. Propaganda transformed neighbors and colleagues into potential vigilantes. Even those who did not adhere to racial hatred could become trapped in the logic of silence for fear of being associated with the enemy. In these groups, resistance took on intimate forms, preserving traditions, maintaining support networks, resisting emotional resignation to marginalization. Among the soldiers sent to the front, the relationship with propaganda fluctuated between hope and frustration. In the early years, newsreels reinforced the perception that they were part of an invincible force. But as the conflict became harder, many soldiers discovered that the propaganda did not match what they were experiencing. The contrast between the heroic image of the fighter and the harshness of the front generated disillusionment. However, that disillusionment rarely translated into general rejection of the regime. The propaganda had taught them to interpret sacrifice as part of a higher duty. Many soldiers accepted the discrepancy between reality and narrative as a necessary price to sustain morale at home. In the rear guard, especially during the Allied bombings, the civilian population developed particular forms of emotional resistance. Although propaganda emphasized unity and strength in the face of destruction, many citizens experienced fear, fatigue, and despair. In air raid shelters, conversations emerged that would rarely have been spoken in open spaces. Some families murmured doubts about the war, others showed resentment towards the arrogance of leaders, and many merely expressed deep fatigue. These small emotional fractures never led to revolts, but they evidenced that propaganda acceptance was more a social mask than an absolute conviction. In the last few years of the conflict, propaganda became so intense that it generated an unexpected phenomenon, a collective emotional exhaustion. The endless speeches about sacrifice, total resistance, and the destruction of the enemy began to lose strength among sectors of the population. The saturation caused some citizens to adopt an attitude of internal disconnection, listening to the propaganda without really absorbing it. This silent detachment did not weaken the regime enough to topple it, but it revealed a psychological limit. Even the most sophisticated propaganda system cannot maintain a constant emotional tension without wearing down those who receive it. Despite these fractures, it is undeniable that propaganda had a profound effect on the human experience under Nazism. It did not turn all Germans into fervent believers, but it did shape the frameworks through which they interpreted their daily lives. Even those who did not fully accept the official message used it as a reference point. The regime had achieved something more subtle than absolute obedience. It had installed an emotional climate that delineated what was speakable, thinkable, and possible. Society moved within a structure of mirrors. Each individual saw their own image reflected in an environment where propaganda occupied all spaces. Some mirrors reflected enthusiasm, others fear, others resignation. But all belonged to the same apparatus. Propaganda did not need to uniform souls. It only had to keep them within the same emotional labyrinth, where each corridor led, one way or another, to the regime. The mirage in ruins, the collapse of the narrative, and the final creed of Goebbels. The final phase of the Third Reich represented the ultimate test for the propaganda system built over more than a decade. Goebbels had designed an apparatus capable of absorbing doubts, reinterpreting failures, and sustaining a psychological illusion even when reality began to contradict it. However, no manipulation mechanism could indefinitely withstand the weight of a military and social collapse. Starting in 1943, the official narrative began to show visible cracks, and the Ministry of Propaganda was forced to reformulate its discourse, intensifying it to extreme limits with the aim of preventing the German population from falling into discouragement. The propaganda ceased to be an instrument of cohesion to become a device of psychological containment. The defeat at Stalingrad marked a fundamental turning point. Until that moment, the regime had built a narrative based on the inevitability of victory. Every military campaign was presented as a demonstration of Hitler's strategic genius and German superiority. But Stalingrad was too big to hide, and Goebbels understood that the only option was to redefine its meaning. The surrender could not be described as a defeat, but as a heroic sacrifice. In speeches, articles, and newsreels, the soldiers trapped in the city were exalted as an example of unwavering devotion. The tragedy was turned into a myth. With this rhetorical operation, Goebbels sought to transform national pain into determination. But this change in narrative came with internal costs. The population, accustomed to years of triumphs, began to perceive the distance between the ministry's epic tale and daily reality. The food shortages, the death of relatives, the destruction caused by the bombings. The propaganda intensified its tone to close this gap. The language became more solemn, more desperate, and more totalizing. The figure of the enemy was more strongly demonized. The Allies stopped being mere adversaries to become an existential threat, bent on destroying not just the regime, but the German people. This description sought to generate fear, and fear needed to transform concern into obedience. In parallel, the propaganda apparatus began to emphasize the idea of total war. Goebbels presented this concept as the only logical response at a critical moment. In the famous speech of 1943 at the Sportpalast, he not only appealed to sacrifice, but also established an emotional framework that identified the country's survival with the absolute commitment of every citizen. It was not just a moral call, it was a narrative structure designed to close all possible psychological exits. Goebbels knew that if the population accepted the idea that only total resistance could guarantee their future, then any doubt or fatigue could be interpreted as treason. This insistence on total war had contradictory effects. On one hand, many citizens adopted a spirit of resistance that prolonged the regime's ability to sustain the conflict. On the other, the emotional pressure generated a profound exhaustion. The propaganda, in its attempt to keep the illusion of destiny intact, began to fragment the internal experience of the population. People clung to rituals and official messages because there was no other narrative available, but those same messages began to be perceived as echoes of a system that was losing control over the events. Life in German cities reflected this tension. Allied bombings intensified civilian suffering, and propaganda responded by highlighting images of heroic resistance. The streets filled with rubble were presented as a testament to the people's strength. Newsreels showed brigades of women removing debris from destroyed buildings, workers repairing railway lines, and citizens helping each other. These images sought to counter fear and fatigue. However, the reality experienced by the Germans was increasingly diverging from the official narrative. The destruction was too evident to be reinterpreted without internal questioning. As the war progressed, the enemy's manipulation took on a more visceral tone. The propaganda focused on the Soviet threat, presenting it as a brutal force willing to devastate Germany. This strategy was not without basis. Soviet troops were advancing rapidly and seeking to avenge years of German violence in the east. However, Goebbels deliberately exaggerated the threat to intensify collective fear. The image of the Red Army became a tool to maintain internal cohesion. The message was clear: Surrender meant annihilation. Resisting was the only option. The narrative of sacrifice, already established since Stalingrad, was amplified in the last months of the regime. Goebbels began to promote stories of voluntary teenagers, armed elderly and ordinary citizens, who opposed the Allies house by house. These stories were not always invented. The reality of the military collapse forced the recruitment of all sectors of the population. However, propaganda transformed these facts into examples of patriotic virtue. The aim was to slow the spread of doubt. In a context where defeat was becoming evident, the propaganda insisted that dignity lay in continuing to fight. The figure of Hitler during this period acquired an almost religious hue. The propaganda portrayed him as an invincible leader in spirit, even though his public presence diminished. Goebbels took it upon himself to cultivate an image of Hitler as a silent strategist, focused on directing the war from the center of power. His physical isolation was reinterpreted as spiritual concentration. In speeches, Goebbels spoke of the Führer as a man burdened with the weight of the nation's destiny. This approach aimed to keep alive the faith in a leader increasingly disconnected from the outside world. Inside the regime, however, the propagandistic narrative was beginning to crack. The military officers knew that the war was lost, and many political leaders recognized that the system was collapsing. Goebbels, on the other hand, clung to his role as guardian of the narrative. In his diaries, he demonstrated an almost mystical conviction in the historical mission of Nazism. His faith did not diminish with reality. On the contrary, it intensified. For him, propaganda was not just an instrument of power, but a moral duty. If Germany was to fall, it should fall believing. There was no room for half measures. This conviction reached its peak when the Allies advanced on Berlin. The propaganda could no longer hide the disaster. The radio broadcasts spoke openly of the fighting in the streets, but insisted that the resistance was a form of greatness. Goebbels began to use a language that combined tragedy and exaltation. The fall was not described as defeat, but as a monumental test that would demonstrate the nobility of the people. This deeply emotional narrative sought to turn the destruction into a final act of loyalty. In this context, what could be called Goebbels' final creed was born. He knew that defeat was inevitable, but his goal was no longer to win the war, but to keep the spirit of the regime intact until its last moment. This creed was based on three essential ideas: absolute loyalty to the Führer, the conviction that defeat was the enemy's fault and not the regime's, and the belief that total sacrifice preserved the historical dignity of the German people. This set of ideas was repeated in speeches, articles, and radio broadcasts until the last days of April of 1945. Hitler's death on the 30th of April confirmed the final ruin of the narrative. For Goebbels, this news did not represent only the political end of the regime, but the dissolution of the moral center of his narrative. Without the leader, no narrative was possible. His decision to remain in Berlin was not an impulsive act, but consistent with his vision of destiny. Goebbels had built a symbolic world where surrender was worse than death. In the bunker, he continued to direct the last radio broadcasts, insisting on the strength of the German spirit even when the Soviet troops were meters away. In his last hours, he made decisions that reflected the internal logic of his final creed. He eliminated his own children, convinced that a life without National Socialism was meaningless for them. This act, deeply disturbing, was the culmination of a vision where propaganda had replaced reality until it became total identity. In the end, Goebbels could not escape from his own construction. The illusion he had created for millions became his only refuge. The fall of the regime revealed the magnitude of the mirage. The Germans, who for years had listened to speeches about greatness, destiny, and sacrifice, found themselves with ruins, destroyed cities, and an overwhelming defeat. The propaganda had not only been an instrument of control, but a lens that distorted collective perception. Its collapse not only released information, it forced millions to face the emotional distance between what was lived and what was believed. Goebbels' propaganda project ended in ashes, but its impact endured. It showed to what extent a state can build an identity based on carefully crafted narratives, and how those narratives can be sustained even in the face of the most brutal evidence. Propaganda not only accompanied the war, it was an essential weapon to prolong it. And in its final collapse, the fragility of any system that attempts to replace reality with an absolute narrative was exposed.